For centuries, humanity had been regarded as the diplomats of the galaxy. Among the countless species that formed the Galactic Council, they were the ones who sought compromise, who extended the olive branch even when war seemed inevitable. Humanity's patience was legendary, its endurance unparalleled. No matter how many insults were hurled at them, no matter how often they were slighted, they refused to retaliate with violence. The Vrex Dominion had long tested the limits of that patience. A warlike species, they viewed diplomacy as a weakness. Their reptilian faces twisted in amusement every time a human ambassador entered the council chamber, speaking of unity, cooperation, and mutual growth. To the Vrex, such words were empty rhetoric. In their culture, respect was not earned through conversation. It was taken through conquest. They had watched humanity's restraint with growing contempt, pushing the boundaries of what they could get away with. At first, the infractions were minor. Vrex warships would stray into human-controlled space, accidentally violating territorial borders. When caught, they would issue half-hearted apologies, blaming navigation errors or malfunctioning equipment. Then came the trade disputes, human cargo ships vanishing near Vrex colonies, only for their contents to appear on Vrex markets at reduced prices. The Terran Union had protested, bringing forth undeniable evidence of piracy, but the Council always urged patience. Sanctions will be imposed, they said. Investigations will be launched, but nothing ever came of it. As the years passed, the Vrex became bolder. Raids on human border colonies grew frequent, justified under flimsy pretenses of territorial disputes. When human defense forces intercepted their war parties, the Vrex simply withdrew, knowing full well that humanity would not escalate the conflict. Humanity filed diplomatic complaints, demanded justice, and awaited action from the Council. But the other species, those who had benefited from human diplomacy for so long, chose to look the other way. Some feared that challenging the Vrex would provoke a war. Others quietly profited from humanity's suffering. And so, humanity endured, until the attack on Charon Prime. Charon Prime was not a military outpost. It was not a strategic asset or a contested world. It was an agricultural colony, a world of rolling green fields and vast oceans, where families had settled to live in peace. The colony had no planetary defenses beyond a basic security force. Farmers and merchants who had never seen battle. There was no reason for the Vrex to attack, and yet, on the 23rd cycle of the Galactic Standard Year, a fleet of Vrex warships entered the system, descended through the atmosphere, and turned the planet into an inferno. The attack was swift, brutal, and absolute. Orbital bombardments shattered entire cities, reducing them to molten craters. Fields burned under torrents of plasma, leaving nothing but scorched earth. Those who attempted to flee in civilian transports were hunted down like prey, their ships torn apart before they could break orbit. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones were taken. No distress signal made it past the planetary jammers deployed by the Vrex. No calls for help reached the Terran Union. By the time a patrol fleet arrived, Charon Prime was nothing more than a smoldering graveyard. Over 15 million people had lived on that world. Less than 200 survived. The Vrex did not bother denying what they had done. When questioned by the Council, their high warlord, Zalvor, stood before the assembly and laughed. His scales shimmered in the dim lighting of the chamber as he spoke, his voice a guttural growl. Charon Prime was an insult. You claim to be strong, yet you allow your worlds to sit defenseless. You let them grow fat and complacent, protected only by empty words. We have merely reminded you of reality. The council chamber erupted in outrage. Delegates from countless species condemned the Vrex, denouncing the slaughter of civilians as a crime against the very foundation of interstellar law. Proposals for sanctions were brought forward, arguments flared, but in the end, as always, nothing was done. The Council had no military of its own. It relied on its members to enforce its decisions, and no species was willing to challenge the Vrex directly. All eyes turned to the human ambassador, waiting for him to respond. He stood at the center of the chamber, clad in the deep blue of the Terran Union, his face unreadable. For a long time he said nothing. Then, finally, he spoke. The Terran Union will issue a formal response in due time. And with that, he turned and walked away. The council chamber fell silent. Even Zalvor's smug grin faltered. Something was different this time. There was no protest, no demand for justice. Just those few words, a formal response. That night, the human embassy was emptied. Every diplomat, every staff member quietly packed their belongings and boarded shuttles bound for Terran space. The following day, every trade agreement, every diplomatic treaty, every cooperative effort between humanity and the greater galactic community was nullified. Human fleets began moving. Civilian ships were recalled. Military assets repositioned. Intelligence operatives disappeared into the shadows, their missions unknown. The galaxy had seen humanity endure every insult, every slight, every betrayal. But for the first time in history, they had seen something else. Silence. And silence from humanity was more terrifying than any war cry. Ixelvor reclined on his war throne, claws drumming lazily against the armrests, as he watched the latest transmissions from the Galactic Council. The chamber was filled with the guttural laughter of his subordinates, warriors who had spent their lives spilling blood across the stars. The humans had not retaliated. They had not sent their fleets. They had not even delivered another weak plea for justice. Instead, they had simply left. The Terran Union had severed all ties, withdrawing their people, closing their embassies, and shutting down every cooperative venture. Pathetic, Zalvor muttered, his lip curling in disgust. I expected more. He waved a clawed hand, and the holographic display before him shifted to a map of human-controlled space. Dozens of red markers blinked on the screen. Planets, stations, and colonies that had once been integrated into the wider galactic community. Now they stood alone, their borders closed to outsiders. No ships entered. No ships left. This is fear, one of his commanders sneered. They run, like prey sensing the presence of a true predator. Galvary leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. No, he murmured. This is something else. He had studied humans for decades, longer than most of his warriors had been alive. He had seen them beg for diplomacy, even when war was the logical course. He had watched them endure humiliation, accepting one betrayal after another in the name of peace. And now, with a single sentence, they had vanished from the political stage. Something was wrong. A lesser warlord might have let the matter rest, content with the humiliation already inflicted on humanity. But Zalvor had not earned his title through complacency. He wanted certainty. He wanted proof. He wanted to know that humanity was truly broken. 3 weeks after the attack on Saren Prime, the Vrex launched their next strike. It was not a full-scale invasion. Zalvor was not yet prepared for that. No, this was a test, a calculated probe designed to gauge the humans' response. A single Vrex raiding fleet, 10 warships in total, slipped into Terran space under the cover of a magnetic storm. Their target was a small industrial colony on the edge of human territory, a mining outpost known as Doran 3. The planet had no heavy defenses. The local security force consisted of a few outdated gunships and a scattering of orbital turrets. A minor settlement, hardly worth a true military engagement. The attack was swift. Vrex soldiers stormed the mining facilities, executing workers and capturing the survivors. The few defenders were cut down with ease, their weapons pitiful against the onslaught of trained warriors. Within an hour, the colony belonged to the Vrex. The banners of the Dominion flew over the smoking ruins, and Zalvor's forces transmitted a single message back to their homeworld. No resistance, no response. The warlord read the report with a growing sense of unease. No Terran fleet arrived to reclaim the colony. No human warships even attempted to approach. The silence stretched on, unnerving even the most hardened of his warriors. They are broken, one of his strategists assured him. The humans have no fight left in them. Zalvor was not convinced. For days he waited for a response. None came. No distress signals were intercepted, no calls for aid reached the wider galaxy. It was as if the humans had not even noticed the loss of their colony. The silence was absolute, and that terrified him. In the heart of Terran space, behind the impenetrable wall of closed borders, Admiral Elias Brown stood before a darkened war table, his hands clasped behind his back. His face, lined with age and experience, was unreadable as he watched the latest tactical reports scroll across the screen. Doran 3 had fallen. He had known it would. He had let it happen. All around him, the command center was quiet. Officers moved with precise efficiency, speaking only when necessary. There was no panic, no outrage. The loss of the colony had been expected, planned even. "They think we are weak," a voice said beside him. Brown turned his head slightly. General Lillian Vasquez stood at his side, arms folded, her expression unreadable. She had fought the Vrex before. She knew their kind. She had predicted this move before it even happened. "They expect us to retaliate," she continued. "To send a fleet, engage them in battle, prove that we still have teeth." Brown exhaled slowly. "And if we did, what would that accomplish?" Vasquez didn't answer. She didn't need to. The Vrex had spent decades testing humanity's patience, pushing them to their limits, waiting for an excuse to escalate the conflict. If humanity responded now, it would be on the Vrex's terms. Another battle. Another opportunity for the Galactic Council to step in and demand restraint. No, that would not do. Brown turned back to the war table. "Let them think we are weak," he said quietly. "Let them think we are afraid." His fingers moved across the screen, inputting a series of commands. The room remained silent as officers watched, waiting, and when the time comes, the display changed. Tactical projections, fleet movements, logistics reports, all the pieces of a much larger operation that had been set in motion the moment Serene Prime burned. "We will remind them why they should have been afraid of us all along." Zalvor paced through his war chamber, tail flicking in irritation. Weeks had passed, and still humanity remained silent. No ships moved. No threats were issued. "Where are they?" he growled. His advisors hesitated, glancing at one another. They did not know. No one did. The humans had become ghosts. Entire fleets had vanished from the galactic grid, withdrawing to unknown locations. Intel reports came back empty. Trade lines had gone dark. There were no transmissions, no diplomatic messages, no attempts to negotiate. It was as if humanity had simply disappeared. Zalvas clenched his claws. This was not how things were supposed to unfold. He had expected defiance. He had expected retaliation. He had expected humanity to lash out in some desperate, last-ditch effort to regain its pride. Instead, they were doing nothing, and that terrified him more than anything. He turned to his second-in-command. "Expand the raids, hit more colonies, draw them out." The officer hesitated. "And if they still do not respond?" Zalvor's eyes gleamed in the dim light of the chamber. "Then we take the war to their core worlds." He bared his fangs. They cannot hide forever. Zalvar stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring at the projection of the latest reports. His forces had moved deeper into Terran space, striking at multiple colonies. Still, humanity had not responded. No fleets arrived to intercept his warships. No distress signals were sent to the Council. It made no sense. The Galactic Council had begun whispering of human cowardice. Delegates muttered that the Terran Union had finally accepted its place beneath the Dominion. But Zalvor did not believe it. He had seen humans fight before. They were not the kind to simply surrender. His claws tightened around the edge of the hollow table as his eyes scanned the latest movements. The silence stretched, thick and unnatural. This was not cowardice. This was not surrender. This was something far worse. "High Warlord," his second-in-command called from the communications array. "We have lost contact with the Fourth Fleet." Zalvor's eyes snapped up. "Explain," the officer swallowed. The fleet was stationed at the Doran system, awaiting further orders. Routine reports ceased 5 hours ago. No distress signals were received. No wreckage has been found. Zalvor's tail flicked. Their last transmission? The officer hesitated before playing the recording. Static filled the room, followed by a garbled voice. Shadows in the asteroid field. Moving too fast. Wait, no. The message cut off. Silence followed. Zalvor exhaled slowly. Send a reconnaissance squadron. I want— High Warlord, another officer shouted. We are detecting massive energy fluctuations across multiple Dominion outposts. Zalvor turned sharply. What kind of fluctuations? The officer's voice wavered. Pre-attack signatures, coordinated. The humans are— Alarms blared. The ship's main display lit up with warning markers across multiple sectors. Humanity had finally answered. The first strike came in the darkness of deep space. The Dominion's forward operating base at Raxar 9 was a fortress, its defenses among the strongest in the sector. Shielded battlements lined the station, and a fleet of warships stood guard, confident in their superiority. Then the humans arrived. They did not come in a grand formation, nor did they announce their presence with hails or threats. There was no visible approach, no sensor warnings, no buildup of warp signatures. One moment the station floated in the abyss, secure in its defenses. The next, hell itself descended. From the shadows of the asteroid belt, sleek human warships emerged, their hulls painted in the blackness of void. They did not charge in a reckless frontal assault. Instead, they moved with surgical precision, slipping past automated defenses before the Dominion even realized what was happening. Orbital guns began firing, but the shots hit nothing. The human ships were too fast, too coordinated. And then the real attack began. Kinetic rounds, traveling at near relativistic speeds, tore through hull plating like paper. AI-guided missiles found their targets before Dominion fighters could even launch. Precision railgun fire severed communication arrays, leaving the station blind and alone. Within minutes, the once mighty base was reduced to drifting wreckage. The surviving Dominion forces sent out distress signals, but no help arrived, because the same thing was happening across every outpost the Vrex controlled. Zalvor watched in stunned silence as reports flooded in. One after another, his forward bases fell. His fleets were being torn apart before they could even react. Human warships struck like ghosts, appearing and disappearing in the void, never staying in one place long enough to be countered. Where did they get this fleet? An officer stammered. Zalvor clenched his jaw. They had been preparing. That was the truth. Humanity had never been weak. They had simply been waiting. The silence had been a trap. The withdrawal, the lack of retaliation, the absence of distress signals, it had all been part of a plan. The humans had not cowered in fear. They had been repositioning, analyzing, learning. And now, with terrifying precision, they were dismantling his entire war effort. His claws dug into the command console. Mobilize all forces, every fleet, every warship. We must. High Warlord! Another officer turned, his expression pale. It's not just the outposts. Zalvor's eyes narrowed. Explain. The officer hesitated before displaying the latest intelligence reports. They are inside Dominion space. The words settled over the bridge like a death sentence. Xavier's head snapped toward the display, where red markers, human strike forces, had appeared deep within his own territory. Not at the edges, not at the borders. They were inside his empire. The capital world of the Dominion Vrexkar had never been attacked in the history of its existence. Its orbital defenses were unmatched, its fleets impenetrable. The Dominion's rulers had always believed themselves untouchable, until now. Without warning, explosions erupted across the planet's upper atmosphere. Defense stations, long considered indestructible, detonated in synchronized blasts. Automated turrets, built to withstand sieges, were hacked and turned against their own fleets. Human ground forces landed on the surface with terrifying efficiency, dropping into the streets of the capital city before the Dominion's military could respond. They did not waste time with speeches or demands. They did not come to negotiate. They came to end this war. Exilvar's personal war fleet launched from the capital, desperate to push the invaders back. He had expected a final battle. He had expected a grand war. Instead, the moment his fleet broke orbit, every ship was immediately locked onto by human targeting systems. The humans had already won. Zalvor stared at the overwhelming force arrayed against him. He had spent his life believing strength was measured by dominance, that diplomacy was weakness, that patience was submission. He had believed humans were too soft to ever fight back. He had been wrong, and now the consequences of that mistake loomed before him. A transmission came through. Admiral Elias Brown's face appeared on the display, his expression calm. "High Warlord," he said, "humanity's patience has ended." And then the war truly began. Zalvor stood motionless as the transmission ended, the image of Admiral Brown disappearing from the main display. The bridge of his flagship had fallen into stunned silence. Officers, once confident in their superiority, now watched him with uncertainty. The humans had not just retaliated. They had dismantled the Dominion's outer defenses in mere days. They had not just struck back. They had reached the heart of Rexkar itself. He gritted his teeth, claws digging into the control panel as he turned toward his second-in-command. "Deploy every remaining fleet. Recall all active warbands from the frontier. I want every available warship forming a defensive perimeter around the homeworld." The officer hesitated before responding. "High Warlord, our fleets are already engaging the humans across multiple sectors. If we withdraw them now..." Exhaling Vor slammed his fist against the console, the impact sending a shudder through the chamber. "If we do not, there will be no Dominion left to defend." The officer flinched but obeyed, relaying the orders. Zalvor turned back to the tactical display. The humans had surrounded his empire without any fanfare, cutting off supply lines, isolating fleets, and dismantling outposts with surgical precision. The bulk of his forces were scattered, spread thin across dozens of systems, while the humans concentrated their full might on the core worlds. This was no conventional war. This was extermination. In orbit above Rexkar, human warships moved like shadows, each maneuver calculated and deliberate. The Terran fleet had not engaged the planetary defenses immediately. Instead, it had waited, allowing the Dominion to panic, to scramble its forces into defensive positions. Then, with terrifying precision, the assault began. Railguns fired from extreme distances, their kinetic rounds tearing through Vrex dreadnoughts before their shields could fully charge. AI-guided missiles wove through the chaos, striking at key targets. Command ships, supply carriers, and communication hubs. Admiral Brown stood at the center of his war room, watching as the Dominion's defenses crumbled. His face betrayed no emotion. He had spent his life preparing for war, but he had never wanted this. Humanity had spent decades pleading for peace, enduring humiliation, suffering through diplomatic betrayal, but those days were over. General Lillian Vasquez's voice came through the comms. "Ground forces are deployed. We have taken the outer districts of the capital." Brown nodded. "Status of planetary resistance?" "Scattered," she replied. The Dominion was never prepared for an invasion on its own soil. They expected to always be the aggressors. Brown exhaled slowly. He had studied the Vrex for years, had learned their weaknesses, their arrogance, their blind spots. They thrived on conquest, on preying upon the weak. They had never considered the possibility of being outmatched. Now, they were learning. Exilvor marched through the war chambers of the Dominion's Central Command, his mind racing. He had underestimated the humans. He had believed their patience was weakness, but their silence had been nothing more than a sharpened blade, waiting for the right moment to strike. A transmission from the Planetary Defense Council blinked on the main screen. One of his generals, bloodied and breathless, appeared. "High Warlord, we cannot hold the capital. The humans are advancing too quickly. Their weapons! A deafening explosion drowned out his voice, the feed cutting to static. Exalver's claws curled into fists. Evacuate the civilians to the inner city sectors. Form a last defensive line around the palace district. We will not surrender this world without a fight. Another officer stepped forward. High Warlord, if we do not negotiate now, there may be nothing left. Zalvor turned and struck him, his claws slashing across the officer's face. The warrior stumbled back, clutching his wounds, but did not dare protest further. Zalvor had not spent his life building an empire just to let it fall in a single battle. He would fight until his last breath. He would not kneel to the humans. The streets of Vrexkar burned. Human ground forces moved with ruthless efficiency, their armor deflecting the few remaining defenses the Dominion could muster. Precision strikes neutralized strongholds before they could organize a counterattack. General Vasquez led the charge, her soldiers advancing through the ruined city. She had seen war before. She had fought on countless battlefields. But never had she seen an enemy break so quickly. The Vrex had built their empire on fear, but fear worked both ways. She stepped over the body of a fallen Dominion warrior, his blade still clutched in his claws. His expression, even in death, was frozen in disbelief. He had not expected to lose. "Status on the Palace District," she asked over comms. A lieutenant responded. "We are surrounding the perimeter. Resistance is minimal." Vasquez pressed forward, her boots crunching against debris. The end was near. Inside the palace, Zalvor watched as his empire collapsed. The last of his warlords had fallen. His fleets were shattered. His city was overrun. The doors to the war chamber burst open, and human soldiers flooded inside, weapons raised. Zalvor bared his fangs, but did not move. Then, through the ranks of armored soldiers, Admiral Brown stepped forward. His expression was unreadable, his uniform unstained, his stance unwavering. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Brown broke the silence. "You were warned." Zalvor's claws twitched, his breathing heavy. "Do what you came here to do, human." Brown did not blink. "Your empire is finished." Athelrad bared his teeth in a snarl. "You think you have won? My kind do not beg. We do not kneel." Brown's gaze remained steady. "Then you will fall standing." For the first time in his life, Zalvor felt something he had never known before, fear. And then the war was over. Smoke still lingered in the air above Vrexkar. Fires burned in the ruins of once mighty structures, their embers casting an eerie glow over the shattered remains of the Dominion's capital. What had once been a symbol of strength and conquest was now a graveyard of ambition. Admiral Elias Brown stood on the balcony of the Dominion's former war palace, staring out over the devastated city. Human soldiers moved with methodical precision below, securing the last remnants of resistance, though there was little fight left in the surviving Vrex forces. The war was over. The Dominion had fallen. But now came the true challenge, the one history would remember. General Lillian Vasquez approached from behind, stopping a few steps away. "The last strongholds have surrendered. Resistance is non-existent. The planet is ours." Brown did not turn. "And Exalver?" Vasquez's expression darkened. "Dead. He refused to surrender. Our forces took the palace, but he fought to the end." Brown exhaled, his shoulders rising and falling with slow deliberation. He had expected as much. Zalvor had built his empire on the idea that submission was worse than death. He had chosen the only path his kind would have considered honorable, but honor had not saved him. Brown finally turned, his gaze meeting Vasquez's. "And the council?" She smirked, though there was no amusement in her eyes. Panic. "They're afraid, Elias. They see what we've done, and now they're scrambling to figure out where they stand in this new reality." Brown nodded. He had expected that too. The Galactic Council had long dismissed humanity, treating them as little more than a stabilizing force, an intermediary between warring factions. But now, humanity was no longer the voice of patience and diplomacy. They had proven what happened when that patience ran out. "The question is," Vasquez continued, crossing her arms, "what happens next? Brown glanced down at the burning city. That depends on them. The transmission from the Galactic Council arrived only hours later. The chamber, usually filled with smug, self-assured politicians, was eerily quiet. The representatives who once spoke over human diplomats now listened in complete silence. They had seen the reports, they had witnessed the fall of the Dominion, and for the first time in history, the entire galaxy understood what humanity was truly capable of. The Speaker of the Council, a thin, gray-skinned Orvaxian, cleared his throat. "Admiral Brown," he began, his voice measured, "the Council wishes to discuss the resolution of this conflict." Brown sat at the center of the war chamber aboard his flagship, his expression unreadable. "The war is over." The speaker nodded hastily. "Yes, of course. And, given the circumstances, the Council is prepared to formally acknowledge humanity's role in restoring peace to the galaxy." Vasquez, standing behind Brown, scoffed quietly. "Peace," she muttered. Brown remained still. "Go on." The speaker hesitated. We believe it would be beneficial for all parties involved if we could reach an agreement on how to proceed. The Dominion controlled vast territories. With Zalvor gone, those systems lack leadership. A power vacuum of this magnitude could destabilize the entire galactic order. Brown let the words hang in the air. He knew what the Council wanted. They were afraid of what humanity would do next. If the Terran Union claimed the former Dominion territories as its own, it would shift the balance of power in a way the Council had never anticipated. The Council had always assumed that humanity needed their approval to act. Now they were realizing the truth. "We are not conquerors," Brown said finally. "The Terran Union has no interest in ruling over unwilling worlds." The speaker exhaled in visible relief. "That is reassuring. But," Brown continued, his voice firm, "the old ways are done. The Council ignored every violation, every atrocity, every act of aggression committed against us. That will never happen again." The speaker opened his mouth, but Brown pressed on. "Humanity will no longer be the galaxy's diplomat. If another species believes it can exploit our patience, let what happened to the Dominion serve as the only warning they will ever receive." The silence that followed was absolute. After a long pause, the speaker nodded. "Understood, Admiral Brown." The transmission ended. The Council had no choice but to accept humanity's terms. The war had changed everything. The balance of power had shifted permanently. Weeks later, Brown stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching as the last of the Terran fleets withdrew from Dominion space. The war had been won. But humanity had no interest in ruling over its fallen enemies. Instead, they had left the surviving Vrex to decide their own fate. Without their warlord, without their empire, they were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. Vasquez approached, her expression unreadable. "You think they'll recover?" Brown shook his head. "Not in our lifetime. The Vrex were broken. They would never again hold the power they once wielded. The galaxy would move on, and humanity would move forward." Vasquez exhaled, glancing at the viewport. "So? What now?" Brown stared into the vastness of space, his expression resolute. "Now we wait." He knew there would be whispers. Fear would spread through the Council, through the remaining empires, through every species that had once dismissed humanity as insignificant. Some would call them monsters. Others would call them necessary. But one truth would remain. No species would ever forget the moment humanity's patience finally snapped, and no one would dare test it again.